In 2003, an archaeologist named Savino Dernia drove a four-wheeled vehicle deep into southwestern Libya, into the Tadrāt Acākus Mountains, a landscape so dry that rain might not fall for a decade. He was looking for evidence of the Green Sahara, a period when this desert was something else entirely. On the second day of excavation at a site called Takarkori rock shelter, his team scraped back a thin layer of sand and found a human jawbone, then a rib cage, then skin. Not fragments, not dust. Skin. Intact, leathery, unmistakably human, preserved by the same brutal heat that should have destroyed it thousands of years ago. They had found a mummy. And then another. Two women, both in their 40s, both buried wrapped in woven mats, both dead for roughly 7,000 years. At the time, nobody understood what these two women would eventually reveal. It took 20 years, 3 separate research teams, and a technology that did not yet exist for the full picture to emerge. And when it did not just rewrite the story of the Sahara. It erased an entire branch of humanity from the map, then put it back. The bridge that wasn't. For most of the 20th century, the scientific consensus about North Africa was straightforward. Humans had moved through the continent in waves. When the Sahara greened up between roughly 14,500 and 5,000 years ago, it became a corridor, not a desert, a savanna. 3.6 million square miles of grassland dotted with permanent lakes, threaded with rivers, home to hippos, elephants, giraffes, and the people who hunted them. People from sub-Saharan Africa moved north. People from the Mediterranean coast moved south. Genes mixed, cultures blended. The Green Sahara was a bridge connecting the two halves of the continent the way a highway connects cities. This idea was elegant. It made geographic sense, and it was supported by thousands of rock paintings in the Tadrāt Acākus Mountains alone. Images of cattle herders with bows, women grinding grain, children playing near water. Pottery found at Saharan sites matched styles from the Nile Valley and from the Sahel, hundreds of kilometers in either direction. You could draw arrows on a map showing populations flowing back and forth across a green continent, and the arrows looked right. The model was published in textbooks, taught in universities, became the default framework for understanding how North Africa was populated. For decades, nobody seriously questioned it. There was just one problem. Nobody had checked the DNA. And I want to be clear about why, because this is the part of the story that gets underappreciated. The error was not laziness. It was a cascade of reasonable assumptions, each reinforcing the next. First, ancient DNA work depends on preservation. Cold climates are ideal. Permafrost in Siberia, limestone caves in northern Europe, high-altitude glaciers in the Andes. The Sahara is the opposite of all of that. Daytime temperatures regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius, humidity near zero, ultraviolet radiation relentless. DNA degrades fast in heat. So for decades, geneticists simply did not bother trying. They assumed, with good reason, that any genetic material in Saharan remains would be too fragmented to read. Second, the archaeological evidence seemed to tell a clear story on its own. When you find pottery from the Nile Valley sitting in a Saharan campsite, the simplest explanation is that people carried it there. When you find cattle bones at a site where wild game was previously the only food source, the simplest explanation is that herders migrated in. Archaeology reads objects. It does not read bloodlines. Third, there was the sheer scale of the blank. North Africa is one of the least genetically sampled regions on Earth. By the early 2000s, Europe had hundreds of ancient genomes. The Near East was catching up. Sub-Saharan Africa had a growing dataset. But between the Mediterranean coast and the Sahel, almost nothing. You can't find a pattern in data that doesn't exist, and you can't question a model when there is no competing evidence. The assumptions were reasonable. They were also wrong. The Archive of Vanished Faces. Before we go deeper into the DNA, I want to pause on something, because this story isn't really about two women. It's about every lineage that has ever disappeared without a name. Think of an archive, a library with no catalog, shelves stretching into darkness. On each shelf, a population that lived for thousands of years, adapted, hunted, loved, buried their dead, and then left no descendant. We don't know their languages, their songs, their names for the stars. All we have are fragments of collagen and degraded nucleotides pulled from a jawbone in a rock shelter. This archive is real. We're only now learning how to read it. The shelter that shouldn't exist. Actually, wait, let me back up for a second, because there's a crucial detail here that explains why Takarkori broke the pattern. The rock shelter isn't out in the open dunes. It's a deep overhang in a mountain range, shielded from direct sun, stable interior temperatures that stay far below the surface extremes. The bodies were buried in dry sand beneath the overhang. That created a micro-environment, essentially a natural desiccation chamber. It preserved soft tissue in a region where preservation should have been impossible. Skin dried before bacteria could consume it, collagen in the bones held together, and inside the densest tissues, tiny fragments of 7,000-year-old genetic material survived. The desert killed the DNA in every other site. This one, by geological accident, saved it. The 2025 breakthrough. In 2019, researchers managed to extract mitochondrial DNA from both Takarkori women. Mitochondrial DNA passes only from mother to child, a narrow window, useful for broad strokes, but not for the kind of detailed population analysis that answers hard questions. Still, even that limited data hinted at something strange. The maternal lineages did not look like what anyone expected for this region. But the real breakthrough came in April 2025. Nadja Salam, a paleogeneticist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, and senior author Johannes Kraus, the institute's director, published a study in Nature that changed the picture completely. They had done what most geneticists thought was impossible. They sequenced the full genomes of both Takarkori women. Not just mitochondrial fragments, the whole genome. The first whole genomes ever recovered from one of the hottest environments on Earth. Salam described the process in interviews. The DNA came from teeth and leg bones, the densest tissues in the body, the ones most likely to shield genetic material from heat. The fragments were short, degraded, riddled with chemical damage signatures that accumulate over millennia. Modern sequencing technology reads these fragments like reconstructing a shredded document. Millions of tiny overlapping pieces scanned and computationally reassembled into something readable. It's slow work. It fails often. But when it works, it gives you something that no amount of pottery analysis or rock art interpretation can give you. The actual genetic identity of a person who has been dead for 7,000 years. Salam's team compared the two genomes against 795 present-day individuals from Africa, the Near East, and Southern Europe, along with 117 ancient genomes from the same regions. And this is where the story turns. The Takarkori women did not carry sub-Saharan African ancestry. None. Zero. In a region that was supposed to be a bridge between North and South, these two women had no genetic connection to the population south of the Sahara. Instead, they belonged to a lineage that had never been seen before, not in any living person, not in any ancient genome on record. A lineage that, according to genomic analysis, split from sub-Saharan African populations roughly 50,000 years ago, right around the time modern humans were beginning the Great Migration out of Africa. While one branch of humanity left the continent to populate Europe and Asia, this group stayed. They stayed in North Africa, and they stayed isolated for tens of thousands of years. Scientists call this a ghost population,
a group whose existence had only ever been glimpsed as faint statistical echoes in the DNA of living people, but whose actual remains had never been found. Until now.
First, what the evidence shows. The Takarkori genomes are closest to 15,000-year-old hunter-gatherers from Taforalt Cave in Morocco, a site associated with the Ibero-Maurusian stone tool culture. Despite being separated by 8,000 years and roughly 2,000 kilometers, both populations share the same deep North African genetic signature. Both are equally distant from sub-Saharan Africans. That is not a coincidence. That is continuity across millennia. Second, what it rules out. The Green Sahara was not a migration corridor, at least not genetically. Despite the lush conditions, despite the lakes and rivers and grasslands, despite the archaeological evidence of cultural exchange, pottery moving between regions, tools being shared, the actual people on either side of the Sahara did not mix. Culture traveled. Genes did not. Harold Ringbauer, a population geneticist at Max Planck, noted that this level of genetic isolation is extraordinary, especially compared to Europe, where populations mixed extensively during the same period. Third, what it implies. The Takarkori women carried Neanderthal DNA, but only about 1/10 the amount found in modern non-African humans, around 0.15%, compared to 1 to 2%. That trace could only have been acquired outside Africa, since Neanderthals lived in Eurasia. So at some point, very early, a small amount of genetic material from outside the continent filtered in. But after that, the door closed. This population lived in near total genetic isolation for tens of thousands of years. The Archive of Vanished Faces, second appearance. Let me read you a list, not of names, we do not have those, but of absences. 84 distinct maternal lineages from pre-Columbian South America, recovered from 92 mummies and skeletons dated between 500 and 8,600 years old. Not one of those lineages exists in any living person today. A founding population in Colombia recovered from 21 individuals on the Bogotá Altiplano, some dating back 6,000 years. Their DNA matched no known ancient group in the Americas, no modern population anywhere on Earth. By 2,000 years ago, they had vanished completely, replaced by a genetically different group with ties to Central America. Kritik said the genes were not passed on, there was a complete exchange of the population. So now we have 3 separate threads converging on the same unsettling conclusion. In the Sahara, a 50,000-year-old lineage that persisted in isolation until it vanished. In South America, 84 maternal lines erased after European contact. In Colombia, a founding population that disappeared long before Europeans arrived, replaced by later migrants from Central America. Different continents, different timescales, different causes of disappearance, but the same result. Entire populations, alive for millennia, gone without genetic trace. The debate, honestly. The debate around these findings is real, and I want to be honest about the tensions. Some researchers argue that the Takarkori sample is too small to draw sweeping conclusions about North African population history. 2 individuals from one rock shelter cannot represent an entire region. Others point out that the Green Sahara's ecosystems, lakes, forests, mountains, wetlands, may have created natural barriers that kept human communities apart. That would explain the isolation without requiring a dramatic narrative. And for the South American data, sampling of modern indigenous populations remains incomplete. It is possible, though increasingly unlikely, that some of those 84 lineages survive in communities that have not yet been genetically tested.
I rewrote this section 3 times because the evidence genuinely pulls in 2 directions. I'm not fully convinced that the corridor model for the Sahara is entirely dead. Cultural exchange did happen. Pottery styles moved. Livestock practices spread. Savino Dernia said himself that the Takarkori community was not culturally isolated. They traded. They adopted herding. They participated in regional networks. The question is whether ideas can travel without people. And the genetic evidence says, at least in this case, they can. That's a genuinely surprising result, and I think it deserves more investigation before anyone closes the book on it. What is not in debate is the larger implication. What the mummies are telling us. The human family tree is not a clean branching diagram. It's a tangle of lines that split, drifted, connected briefly, then disappeared. We know about the branches that survived. We built our models around them. But the mummies are telling us that the branches we lost may have been just as numerous, just as widespread, and just as old as the ones that endured. And here's what keeps me thinking about this story weeks after I first read the paper. The Takarkori women weren't living in some marginal corner of the world. They were herders, they had pottery, they wove baskets and mats. They buried their dead with care, wrapped in textiles, placed in sheltered ground. They lived in a landscape of lakes and grasslands and mountain forests that we can barely imagine when we look at the Sahara today. Their effective population was estimated at around 1,000 people, small enough to know everyone by name, large enough to sustain a culture across generations. And then the rain stopped. The lakes dried. The savanna turned to sand. And a lineage that persisted for 50,000 years, that had weathered ice ages and climate shifts and the entire Neolithic revolution, went silent. We don't know where they went between 50,000 years ago when they split from South African populations and 15,000 years ago when they appear at Taforaut. That's a 35,000-year gap. An entire chapter of a people, unwritten, maybe unwritable. Where did they shelter during the last glacial maximum when the Sahara expanded to its greatest extent? How many communities were there? How far did they range? Johannes Krause put it this way: we do not know where they were hanging out between 50,000 years ago and 15,000 years ago. Nadia Salem and her team are already searching for more ancient genomes across the Sahara, but the odds of finding preservation like Takarkori again are slim. The desert doesn't give up its dead easily. We are still looking, and that, honestly, is the most important part of this story. Not the answers we found, but the scale of what we have yet to ask.